No one anticipated that Princess Anne would turn out to be Prince Harry's most formidable barrier when he subtly began his transition back to royal life. William wasn't the one. Charles wasn't the one. Not even the courtiers had opposed Harry's return for a long time. No, it was Anne, the royal enforcer who never sought publicity, never gave in to pressure, and never gave anyone a second opportunity when they betrayed their trust. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve deeper into what this actually implies for the royal family. Something evil moved behind the castle gates. Anne had all the motivation she needed to act quickly and brutally after hearing rumors of a startling find. Meghan Markle and a few chosen royal employees engaged in a covert cash transaction that exploded like a quiet bomb, the type that shakes the walls from within without producing any sound. Harry's ambitions were modest at first. He wasn't claiming championships back. He wasn't making a big show of coming back. He was negotiating a discreet reintegration, according to insiders, providing assistance amid King Charles's medical crisis. Well, a little low-visibility role, one step at a time. However, Anne was able to discern the timing. Charles wasn't the only issue. State. It was about power, about coming back while the monarchy was weak and getting over the barriers that would have prevented him otherwise. The staff shift followed. Once zealously loyal to Queen Elizabeth, servants and aides started to change their attitude. They abruptly modified their formerly hard stance on Harry and Meghan. It wasn't really loud. The subtlety was too subtle. However, Anne saw every small shift in timing, phrasing, or conduct as a hint. Behind the scenes, someone was tugging strings. Anne's receipt of sensitive information from a high-ranking palace source was the last straw. It wasn't a rumor. It served as a warning. Under the pretense of advice, undisclosed financial activity that came straight from Meghan, rather than Harry, had made its way into palace staff accounts. Anne remained unflinching. She froze, calculating, evaluating, making connections that no one else had yet noticed. The purported payments made by Meghan weren't presents. They weren't nice. They had an impact. Subtle, calculated persuasion intended to undermine royal protections and rewire allegiances. It was also functioning. Anne activated the one weapon no one anticipated her authority to use as soon as she verified it, quiet but uncompromising. Anne vetoed the decision internally. Harry was not allowed to return to royal life, not with the family's shadows looming. Not when the institution's integrity was under jeopardy. Second chances would not exist. As a result, Anne was defending survival as much as tradition. Furthermore, she believed that Harry's homecoming, marred by Meghan's devious actions, was no longer worth the risk. However, what precisely did Anne learn? What transaction was so significant, grave, and combustible that it destroyed any chance of a royal reconciliation? One of the most explosive controversies in the monarchy today could be solved by a ledger hidden deep in palace finances. According to insiders, Princess Anne received a classified document that revealed mysterious payments made by Meghan to palace employees who had previously been faithful to the late Queen rather than by Harry. Who in the organization received these monies, and what was their intended use? Before a senior financial auditor, constrained by royal confidentiality, contacted Anne with something considerably more serious than gossip, it began as a low-key rumor that could have been easily written off as tabloid fantasy. A folder in black. Just names, dates, and numbers that didn't fit together, no fanfare, no explanation. Anne was instantly agitated by the contents of the document. These weren't small accounting oddities or clerical errors. These were deliberate, methodical transactions, transferred straight into palace personnel ledgers from Meghan's personal accounts. Furthermore, the sums were everything but symbolic. Not only was the money what caught Anne's eye right away, but so was the recipient. Those with decades of royal service were identified via the documentation trail. The name of a senior communications advisor who had been the voice behind Queen Elizabeth's most meticulously crafted pronouncements for years jumped out. Elizabeth had been in charge of internal staff discipline for another recipient. These were loyalists and insiders, not outsiders, or so everyone believed. Corporate language was used to conceal the payments, consultation costs, and optional bonuses. The reputation advisory seemed harmless until it was viewed in the context of Harry's abrupt desire to return and the palace's oddly lenient attitude toward him. A single transaction of more than £80,000 was discreetly spread out over 3 months. Coordination was suggested by the practically same terminology used in several transfers. It wasn't charity. This was no coincidence. It was a system. Anne's confidence in the inner workings of the palace was shattered by the implications. No matter the chaos above, she had dedicated her life to preserving an unwritten code that the monarchy's employees could be relied upon, that those who worked for the monarchy did so with unwavering devotion. However, these payments opened the door to coercion, something she considered unimaginable, or worst, cooperation. Within hours, Charles received word. Anne spoke calmly, yet bluntly when she faced him. It was said that Charles was shaken. Out of legacy, not weakness, he had embraced the prospect of a cautious reunion with Harry. But he hadn't anticipated this. Not the ledger, not the cash, nor from Meghan, nor from inside, and definitely not the betrayal. "This is not about family," Anne responded, setting the packet on his desk behind closed doors. "Integrity is at issue here." Charles asked for answers, but he didn't provide any. In actuality, he was unable to defend what he witnessed. Meghan's strategic thinking was something he had always underestimated. However, it appeared that she had now silently and precisely reached into the institution's very machinery. That evening, Anne received a personal note from the Queen's long-retired, but still esteemed former private secretary. One line caught my attention. Elizabeth's silence would be more powerful than words if she were still here to witness this. Anne didn't answer. In her opinion, a decision had already been made. Thus, she didn't need to. That ledger contained evidence of infiltration as well as proof of payment. A silent fight fought with prudence and deposits. A struggle fought in the hushed voices of those who had vowed to serve, rather than in public. And the timeline became more apparent the more she studied it. Long before Harry had even been in touch, this was already happening. Anne started a private inquiry as the money trail grew, and the results she found suggested a sinister trend that might erode the monarchy's internal trust. The staff is the backbone of the palace. They are devoted, covert, and passionately protective. However, a severe rift formed as rumors about Meghan's covert financial incentives became more widespread. The tone of several employees' remarks about Harry and Meghan abruptly changed. Others saw it as betrayal and were furious. Princess Anne ended up in the epicenter of a low-key rebellion. It was nearly undetectable at first. Across briefing tables, glances were shared. Where there had been certainty, there was silence. Employees who used to work with military accuracy now paused. The tone was altered in addition to the wording. In stance, in the subdued uprising that results from withholding allegiances rather than protests. Anne saw more than just discomfort. She saw a rift, a breach, that went right through the heart of the monarchy's functioning. Reports started coming in from a variety of royal household sources. Anne's office received anonymous letters describing minor but well-coordinated behavioral changes. The letters claimed that certain aides had taken outside funding. Officially, no, not in public. But covertly, through private transactions, disguised as thank-you notes or consultation fees. According to the letters, Meghan was the one who sent the funds. The fact that some employees had accepted the cash without asking appalled Anne more than the payments themselves. These weren't inexperienced assistants. These were seasoned members of the Queen's household who had previously taken great satisfaction in their ability to support Elizabeth through good times and bad. It was a betrayal that deeply wounded Anne's unwavering sense of royal duty to believe that they could be persuaded, or worse, thought. It was a quick response. A senior domestic helper, who had been close to the Queen in her latter years, abruptly quit. Although brief, her letter was devastating. She wrote, "I can no longer be a part of a system where values are undermined from within." It was a silent departure, but one that shook the stability of the palace's foundations. How many others felt that way if she was leaving? The walls didn't fall down because Anne didn't wait. She called a private meeting with a number of longtime royal household staff who had worked for the monarchy for many years. No advisors to the public, just the old guard, no middlemen. According to reports, the meeting was tense. Anne exposed everything: the resignations, the ledger, and the names that were disclosed. Then she called out a name that silenced the room. They were reminded of the past queen's uncompromising standards by Queen Elizabeth, her conviction that allegiance was never negotiable or for sale. She discussed the principles, restraint, integrity, and service, that formerly bound the organization. Then she posed a straightforward query: what precisely are we still defending if these ideals disappear? Morale started to falter. A few employees felt in the hunt. Some felt justified. Silently, lines were being drawn. Palace security forces, tasked with guarding members of the royal family, were caught in the middle, unsure of who to believe and who might already be compromised. What surfaced was a complete ideological split, rather than merely internal discord, because the institution starts to deteriorate inside when allegiance turns into a transaction. With each new discovery, Anne witnessed the deterioration spreading more quickly than anyone had anticipated. She was battling for more than just preventing Harry from coming back. At this point, she was trying to keep the royal foundation alive. However, Anne had not yet faced the most perilous component of the puzzle as she advanced to close ranks: Meghan's potential behind-the-scenes job. There is a plan behind every royal upheaval. According to sources, Meghan's outreach to palace employees was deliberate, rather than merely sentimental. Meghan apparently planned a covert effort to rewrite the palace narrative from the inside out, while Harry concentrated on re-establishing contact with family. And Anne was fully aware of the implications for the future of the monarchy. Meghan had known from the start that the royal family didn't have all the power in the palace. It also came from their advisors, employees, and, above all, those who shaped the narrative behind the scenes. Meghan was reportedly already in close contact with people, while the public's emphasis was on Harry's delayed and methodical homecoming. They were in charge of perception, those who were skilled at influencing silence, making headlines, building momentum, and breaking it. She didn't pick the names on the list at random. It includes top advisors, social media handlers, and press secretaries who had previously been the unofficial spokesperson for the monarchy. One of them was a former palace press secretary who continued to have close contacts to the present royal media operation and special access, even though he was no longer formally employed by the crown. Insiders claim that Meghan's team suggested a consulting agreement that was connected to new U.S.-based projects under Meghan's media brand, rather than royal duties. On paper, the concept seemed to be standard business, including reputation management, influence building, and communication strategy across transatlantic media. Beneath such rhetoric, however, was a more unsettling truth. These people were more than just communications gurus. Aligning them with a private endeavor meant one thing, since they were curators of royal memory. Voices trained from within might be used to rewrite the story from the outside. The ramifications were enormous. The institution's ability to defend its own version of history may be undermined if these former palace voices started publicly praising Harry and Meghan, or worse, questioning the palace's internal response to them. It was about power, not just facts. Control over the narrative, the legacy, and the perception of the actual events involving the Sussexes and the crown. Anne didn't wait for verification. She had it already. Transcripts, purported digital recordings of private conversations, off-the-books meetings, and even emails outlining strategic narrative disruption were delivered to her office by anonymous email. Leverage insider voices to legitimize the Sussex perspective is said to have been one particularly noteworthy line. Anne's suspicion was confirmed by just one sentence alone. This wasn't a passive effort to get back in touch. It was a covert campaign that used the people who had previously guarded the gates to reinterpret reality from the outside. Meghan's spokesperson publicly brushed off the rumors as misconstrued professional conversations. However, the term narrative control sent shivers down every hallway in the palace. It was infiltration, not business for Anne. All of Meghan's modest actions, in her opinion, hinted at a lengthy game that didn't need titles or approbation. The correct voices in the proper ears. Anne understood what was going to happen. She had witnessed the harm that shattered narratives might do to constitutional stability, as well as popular perception. Anne realized that she couldn't just react defensively now that Meghan's influence was beginning to seep past the palace's defenses. The source needed to be neutralized. Now that the lines of trust were completely eroded, Anne turned her attention to the one person who had the power to save the monarchy's legacy and determine whether Harry would return. For Anne, this was about legacy rather than merely Harry. Everything that the covert payment suggested was completely at odds with Queen Elizabeth's principles: discretion, responsibility, and integrity. Anne was determined to respect the hints given by the late Queen about who she trusted in her private notebooks and last chats, even if it meant excluding her own nephew. The power of the monarchy has traditionally been gauged by its ability to maintain order in the face of chaos, and Queen Elizabeth was the best example of that idea. Instead of making noise, she had led with determination. Her rule was based on the principle that public duty must never be subordinated to private interests. Anne recalled that. It had been her life. Now that the institution was being undermined from within by rumors of influence and manipulation, Anne found herself turning back to her mother's legacy for clarity rather than solace. Anne went over letters that Elizabeth had written in the last years of her life in the confidential archives at Windsor. Handwritten notes with cautions wrapped in elegance. Only a few months after the Sussexes' Oprah interview, one entry said, "Protect the crown." From deceit disguised as love. It wasn't overly dramatic. It was not a charge. However, Anne saw it as a coded directive, a stark reminder that not all kin are safe, and not all love is loyalty. The anxiety that followed that interview was still fresh in Anne's mind. Those closest to the Queen had noticed the change, but she had maintained her composure on the outside. Those closest to the Queen had noticed the change, but she had maintained her composure on the outside. Discussions became shorter. Trust grew thinner. The disappointment had not been spoken out loud. It had descended upon Buckingham's corridors like a fog. For years, Anne had silently carried that memory with her. Those recollections served as her moral compass when she was confronted with the startling truth of financial influence seeping into the palace ranks. Always the mediator, Charles begged for equilibrium. He asked Anne to think again, should keep in mind that time could heal. Despite all of its problems, their family was worthy of another shot. However, Anne's icy, uncompromising voice broke through the emotion. Bribery cannot be the foundation of it. What we permit in weakness, we normalize in tradition, she stated. Furthermore, this cannot be permitted to become customary. It was a fracture, not just a quarrel. Anne wasn't merely resisting Harry's comeback. She was against the fundamental notion that legacy might be changed by subtly influencing others and making astute payments. This was about more than reputation, in her opinion. It had to do with historical, institutional, moral, and survival issues. Anne clearly stated her viewpoint in a private discussion with a few high-ranking members of the household. She added, We don't sell our silence, neither our ancestry. We will quickly run out of both comfort and truth if we start to twist the facts to suit our needs. She didn't make a big statement. There was no television. However, it reverberated throughout the palace, a last line written with conviction rather than rage. And there was the end of the argument. However, Harry was not aware that a final choice had already been made behind closed doors, while Anne found strength in the past. Harry didn't know that Anne had already worked to ruin his opportunity while he continued to be optimistic, making calls, making concessions, and even writing a loving letter to William. Doors closed, one by one. The one individual who used to support him stopped talking, canceled meetings, and withdrew invitations: his aunt. The way back was clear in Harry's thoughts, with caution, with respect. He started to reach out with humility rather than expectations. He addressed aides. He asked for quick meetings. He was obvious that he didn't want to be in the spotlight again. No titles, no special treatment. A modest position centered on mental health programs, humanitarian activities, and discreetly supporting the family throughout a period of change. It seemed to him like a real effort to make amends for what had been lost. Behind the royal walls, however, his every action was being watched, not maliciously, but cautiously. Because Anne saw a Trojan horse and Harry saw an olive branch. With no publicity, just a father and son sitting down to discuss, and no staff present, he had planned a private lunch meeting with Charles. However, the date came and passed. They rescheduled the meeting, then put off once more. After an endless period, the message finally became evident. Even worse was the hush that ensued after William, Harry's boyhood shadow and once closest ally, failed to respond. "For Mom's sake, can we just talk?" Harry reportedly begged at the end of his private letter. There was never a response. Since Anne had already told William, his silence was an indication of agreement rather than avoidance. Loyal, but now extremely uneasy, Harry's crew started to piece things together. The palace abruptly diverted its emails. Previously precise communications now arrived either late or not at all. One staffer brought up the matter with a top royal contact, but the response was icy. Future alignment is being re-evaluated. Harry could not deny the pattern. They were not inviting him back. They were blocking him. And by deliberate silence, rather than by a public proclamation. Behind closed doors, Anne had expressed her opinions. With terrible clarity, she conveyed a message to Charles. We cannot permit motives to become tainted. It wasn't a declaration. It served as a warning, a last statement from a royal who saw that re-entry was not healing in the existing circumstances. It was dangerous. Furthermore, Anne refused to let the monarchy bear that danger, even for relatives. The absence of conflict was what made it more difficult. No disputes? Harry observed from the outside, trying to figure out where the trail had vanished, while his return plan was quietly unraveled without any dramatic denial. Because in the end of the day, no one had to refuse him. All they had to do was cease speaking. Nevertheless, there remained one more moment, the conflict that Anne was unable to prevent, which would shatter Harry and permanently alter the monarchy. Although it took place in private, word quickly got out. Behind locked palace doors, Princess Anne and Prince Harry faced each other, and what was said during that heated exchange was kept under strict watch. However, according to sources, Anne didn't hold back, leaving Harry stunned and taken aback by what she knew, and even more bitterly, what she now thought about him. There was no set time for the meeting. It was called upon. In just 5 lines, Anne wrote to Harry, "We need to speak." The space was empty of advisors, employees, and handlers. 2 royals with decades of loyalty, one to truth, the other to family. What transpired in that room would be the tipping moment for a relationship that was already broken. Anne didn't start off politely. She presented him with the proof: digital receipts, names, and ledgers, evidence of Meghan's financial dealings with palace officials. Harry hesitated and stammered as he attempted to make sense of the confusion. "I had no idea." "Oh," he said, "it doesn't look like this." Anne, however, did not recoil. The deflection was enough for her. Too much silence has already been witnessed. She now demanded rapid, unambiguous, and unreserved responses. What transpired was a tempest of anger and rage, rather than a peaceful conversation. He was accused by Anne of introducing corruption into the halls that their grandmother had previously revered, of either ignoring manipulation, or worse, allowing it via ignorance. "It's no longer just about you." She lost her temper. "This has to do with the crown, the organization, the bloodline you left behind and now wish to discreetly return as if your decisions had never been made." Harry begged for clarification, caught between heartbreak and defense. "Do you mean that I will never be able to come back? That my efforts will never be sufficient?" Anne remained silent. She didn't have to. The weight of royal history was in her words. She said, "You won't come back under this shadow. Not while the walls we vowed to defend are still marred by the scars of deceit." When Elizabeth's name came into the room, the tension became intolerable. Harry made an effort to win the late Queen's sympathy. Her strength was silent, her affection for her family. However, Anne faced him with a more profound pain: recollections of Elizabeth's last months, her faith in her daughter, and the heartache she never quite expressed. According to Anne, she passed away while witnessing the internal division of this family, and now you return with the very fire she was afraid of. 3. There was silence in the room. It was because everything had been stated, not because there was peace. Devastated, Harry walked away silently. It was colder than ever in the hallway outdoors, and in a moment that might have permanently altered the monarchy's trajectory, Anne stood alone, powerful, proud, but clearly shaken. The narrative was far from ended, but the repercussions was immediate. The crown itself was now under pressure to choose a side, and someone else had been observing. The leaks swirled. A rumor first. After that, Anne blocks Harry and headlines. Covert payments were found. The palace was engulfed in a media frenzy in a matter of hours. In addition to the controversy, the monarchy's legitimacy was being undermined from inside. Someone was planning a last, disastrous move behind the pandemonium. It began with one publication and quickly spread to all of the UK's tabloids, broadsheets, and news channels. According to unnamed sources, a senior royal found financial problems connected to Meghan Markle. They asserted that Princess Anne, not Charles, had prevented Prince Harry from returning. They also asserted that there was still a great deal more that was unknown. Whispers too loud to ignore had broken the monarchy's cautious silence. Meghan's team released a succinct, well-considered statement when the news reports came in. Notably, it did not explicitly deny the existence of payments to former royal workers, instead dismissing the rumors as diversion journalism and highlighting her continued charitable endeavors in the United States. The press only needed that omission as gasoline. Each query that remained unanswered turned into a confirmation, a verdict at each pause. The public's response was swift and sharply split. The moment is seized by anti-monarchists. Loyalists, however, called the disclosures evidence of institutional hypocrisy and demanded that those in the palace who had first permitted access to private information be held accountable, rather than Harry or Meghan. When the veil of secrecy surrounding the royal family broke down, scandal was not the only thing that spilled out. Confusion was the cause, fear and fright. Royal servants rushed to limit the damage. The palace was inundated with late-night meetings, urgent calls, and internal documents. There were denials. There was a threat to sources. However, the truth was already known. There had been an incident, something significant enough to silently prevent a royal comeback. They were now simply able to follow the story. They were no longer in control of it. Senior royals met behind closed doors for what insiders called an emergency trust summit. It was a high-stakes, private gathering to evaluate the threat rather than a public spectacle. Charles served as the chair, with constitutional specialists and legal counsel at his sides. As the controversy grew, even members of Parliament started to wonder what more the palace might be concealing, making the stakes not just personal, but national. Questions concerning royal expenditures, transparency, and whether this was a singular instance or a part of a larger trend were whispered. The term audit started to surface in internal political circles, and it was the most deadly term of all for a monarchy that relied on control to thrive. Even still, one voice held steadfast amid the growing cacophony. Not a single woman was rushing. She was getting ready, because Anne was aware that scandals have repercussions and don't go unnoticed. One woman prepared the ultimate word, the decisive blow that may permanently bury this story as the public demanded answers and the crown struggled for survival, or bring deeper wounds back to life. She stood by herself, unwavering, determined, and devoted to a kingdom she had served without reservation. Anne's last statement was more than a simple denial of Harry's comeback. It was a proclamation of war against any shadow cast on the crown's legacy, including corruption and deception. She made it plain in a low, forceful voice. Her line in the sand was this: Anne was the one who put pen to paper when the murmurs became firestorms. Parliament started to circle, and the media refused to back down. There was no press release, no declaration of performance, only a formal letter, written with centuries of weight and clarity and addressed to the Privy Council. She wrote, "Integrity before inclusion." These 6 words were like a royal gavel, shutting the door on Harry's return, as well as the kind of covert rebellion that had almost brought down the monarchy. A copy was sent to Charles prior to its official filing. Torn between being a father and a king, he sat with it in quiet. Peace was what he had desired. His dream was to reconstruct, but he had to make a decision after reading Anne's letter. This was now a constitutional reckoning rather than a family matter. Furthermore, Charles was aware that any hesitation at this point would not be interpreted as compassion. It would be interpreted as being weak. In the background, William's position was obviously obvious. Although he had not publicly stated it, he had assured confidants and advisers that he fully supported Anne's choice. He described her as the realm's protector, the final unflappable person between the throne and anarchy. He was aware of the price of supporting her, but he was equally aware of the price of remaining silent. The directness with which Anne had addressed Meghan's role unnerved many within the organization. Anne made it clear that the threat had come from the outside rather than from within, without ever mentioning her name. The erosion of devotion, the influence, and the persuasion had all come from someone who did not have a royal title by blood, but used authority with terrifying accuracy, and dubbed it the erosion of internal ideals by external pressure. By doing this, she established a barrier that could no longer be crossed without repercussions. The public's reaction was more vocal than anticipated. Some continued to be quite protective of Harry and Meghan, but more and more started to change their minds. For the first time, Anne was seen as the moral compass of the palace, as well as its iron will. She had said what many were afraid to say. That custom needs to change. It can't be sold, though. The royal household crafted a new decree behind closed doors. The way former working royals might re-engage with the company would be permanently altered. Public popularity and emotional appeals would no longer suffice. New regulations would apply to future re-entry, rules influenced by Anne's determination that duty and dishonesty could not coexist, and her refusal to make concessions. This was not the end. The monarchy's identity was re-evaluated. Therefore, one fact remains, as the royal prepares for its most emotional reckoning in decades. This was more than simply a Harry story. It was about loyalty, power, and a secret that had the potential to permanently alter the monarchy. Thank you for viewing. Remember to subscribe and like, and we'll see you in the next one.